A bedroll hit the hard pan and sent up a puff of flour dust. Then a cracked water jar, set down carefully beside it. Then a blanket, a knife, a sewing awl, each item placed in the dirt with the precision of a man who understood he was looking at everything he owned. Two cavalrymen sat their horses nearby, reins loose, watching the way men watch something that is not their business but is too uncomfortable to ignore. The trader stood on the porch above, arms folded, and the silence between him and the man in the dust had the weight of something that had already been decided. The trader reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a stamped water ticket, and tucked it back inside. Rostam Bahmani had arrived at Camp Cady 11 months earlier with a cracked water jar, a sewing awl, a dull knife, and a notebook filled with wall sketches he had copied from his father's lessons in Yazd. He was 26 years old. He spoke English well enough to negotiate freight repairs, but poorly enough that men mocked his accent when they were drunk or angry. His surname was not Bahmani. That was the ledger name Americans could pronounce. In private, in the voice he kept inside his own skull, he was still Rostam, son of Bahman the plasterer, and the sketches in the notebook were his inheritance. He had come to California the way most unusual arrivals came, through a chain of accidents no one would have planned. A British merchant vessel out of Bandar Abbas, a misunderstanding about labor contracts in San Francisco, a freight company that needed someone who could patch adobe walls and translate enough Farsi to handle a Persian mule trader's complaints near the southern mines. When that work dried up, Rostam drifted east along the desert roads, fixing what needed fixing, sleeping where men let him sleep, and learning that in America, a man without social credit was a man without shade. Camp Cady sat on the Mojave Road like a sore that would not heal. The Army had built it in the early 1860s to protect mail routes and settler traffic through the desert corridor. By 1870, the garrison was a skeleton crew, a dozen cavalrymen, a quartermaster, and a string of civilian hangers-on who survived by selling supplies, water access, and credit to the freighters and prospectors who still used the road. The desert around it was alkali flats, dry washes, and creosote scrub stretching to mountains that shimmered like ghosts in the afternoon heat. Summer temperatures climbed past 115 degrees in shade, past 120 on the worst days. Men who could not find or buy shelter died in that heat, and the dying was not dramatic. It was quiet. A man sat down in the wrong patch of sun, closed his eyes, and never stood again. Rostam had survived 11 months by making himself useful to Hiram Voss. Hiram was 48, sunburned to leather, and owned the only supply shed within a day's ride. He sold water tickets, canvas, rope, flour, salt pork, and tobacco. He also sold credit, which meant he sold debt, which meant he owned men who could not pay him back. His ledger was thicker than his Bible, and he consulted it more often. Rostam had repaired Hiram's shed walls, patched freight wagons, and stitched torn canvas in exchange for a bunk space, a daily water ration, and meals he shared with the mules. It was not a good arrangement. It was the only arrangement available to a Persian laborer with no claim, no relatives, and no reputation that extended past the camp boundary. The arrangement ended on the 23rd of May, 1870. Rostam had finished a freight repair for a teamster named Orley, new sideboards, patched floor, resealed joints. Orley paid Hiram directly, as all payments went through Hiram's ledger. The next morning, Hiram called Rostam to the shed porch and told him the repair had been short. 2 boards had not been replaced. Orley had complained. Rostam knew this was a lie. He had replaced every board Orley marked. He had the nail count in his notebook. But the lie was not the point. The point was the paper Hiram slid across the porch rail, a debt agreement binding Rostam through the full summer in exchange for continued water and shelter. The terms were simple. Rostam would work exclusively for Hiram at Hiram's prices on Hiram's schedule until September. Any outside work required Hiram's permission. Any attempt to leave before the debt cleared would forfeit Rostam's tools and bedding. Rostam read the paper twice. His English was good enough to see the trap. A man who signed that paper in May would owe more by September than he owed in May, because Hiram set the prices, Hiram kept the books, and Hiram decided when a job was finished. Rostam said no. The word landed like a stone in still water. Hiram's face did not change. He folded the paper, put it in his vest, and said, "Then you are short on the Orly job, and your bunk is paid through yesterday." By noon, Rostam's bedroll lay in the dust outside the shed. His cracked water jar sat beside it, his knife, his awl, his blanket, and his notebook. These were his because Hiram could not claim them. But the water ticket Rostam had already paid for, 4 days remaining on a weekly ration, stayed in Hiram's pocket. Rostam did not argue about the ticket. He had watched other men argue with Hiram about tickets. Those men were still arguing when the sun found them without shade. He picked up his bedroll. He picked up his jar. He walked. $2.13. That was the full accounting of what Rostam Bahmani carried away from 11 months of desert labor. $2 in coin, 13 cents in mixed copper, and the contents of a notebook that no one at Camp Cady could read. The nearest real settlement was Daggett, roughly 35 miles west. A man with a full canteen and good boots could walk it in 2 days if he traveled at night. Rostam had a cracked jar that held perhaps a quart and a half, and his boots had been risoled with rawhide that was already peeling. He could buy passage on a freight wagon, but Hiram had spoken to the teamsters. The word was out. The Persian had shorted a job. The Persian was trouble. No wagon would take him without cash payment, and the fare to Daggett was $3. He had $2.13. The math was not complicated. It was fatal. A man with no shade, no reliable water, and no transport, cast out into the Mojave at the edge of summer, had approximately 2 weeks before the sustained heat arrived. 2 weeks in which the daily high would climb from 105 to 115 to 120 and beyond. 2 weeks in which the nights would shorten and the air would stop cooling after dark. Lieutenant Amos Pollard found Rostam that afternoon. Pollard was 41, the cavalry quartermaster, a practical man burned the color of old brick by 15 years of desert postings. He was not cruel. Cruelty required energy, and Pollard spent his energy on supply ledgers and horse health. But he was blunt, and bluntness in the desert carried the same weight as cruelty. Pollard stopped his horse beside Rostam, who sat in the thin shadow of a creosote bush, sorting his possessions into 2 piles, what he could carry and what he could not. "Voss put you out," Pollard said. It was not a question. Rostam nodded. "You have water?" "A jar, maybe a quart." Pollard looked at the jar, then at the sky, then at Rostam. "You know what kills men out here?" "The sun." "No." Pollard shifted in his saddle, believing they can manage the sun. The sun does not negotiate. You need canvas for shade. You need timber to frame it. You need a dug well or a reliable water source. You need those things before June, and you have none of them. Rostam said nothing. He knew the list. Pollard continued, not unkindly, but with the flatness of a man reading a supply report. Shade canvas costs $8 used. A proper tent is $22. Freighted lumber runs more than you will earn in 2 months, assuming anyone hires you, which Voss has made unlikely. A well takes 4 men in 3 weeks if the water table cooperates. And you are 1 man with $2. $2.13, Rostam said. Pollard almost smiled. Almost. Mud keeps rain out, not sun. Out here, it turns into a stove. I've seen adobe walls so hot at midnight a man could not lean against them. My father built walls that stayed cool in summer. Your father was not on the Mojave Road. Pollard gathered his reins. Find passage west. Sell something. Walk at night if you must. But do not stay here thinking you can build your way out of this. Men with 10 times your resources have tried to outlast summer in the open. The ones who succeeded had water, shade, and neighbors. You have none of those. He rode back toward the camp without looking over his shoulder. Rostam sat in the creosote shadow and counted his resources again. $2.13, a cracked jar, a dull knife, a sewing awl, a blanket, and a notebook full of wall sketches drawn by a plasterer in Yazd who had never seen the Mojave and never would. He tried the conventional path first. He spent 3 days asking. He asked the freight depot for scrap boards. The depot man shook his head and pointed at Hiram's shed. All scrap went to Hiram. He asked a cavalry corporal named Rafe Belden for torn canvas. Belden laughed and said, Army canvas was Army property, even the torn kind. Then he said something about Persians and tents that made the other corporal laugh too. He asked Cora Pike. Cora was 32, a widowed mule team cook and washerwoman who had come west with her husband's freight company and stayed after a fever took him near Fort Mojave. She survived by cooking for teamsters and washing cavalry uniforms, and she survived well enough that no one pitied her and no one helped her without getting something back. She was short, burned dark as saddle leather, and had opinions about everything that she delivered with the subtlety of a thrown boot. Rostam asked if she had any torn canvas she might trade. Trade for what? Cora asked, not looking up from the shirt she was scrubbing. Labor. I can patch walls, fix anything with wood or clay. I do not have canvas. I do not have walls. I have shirts that smell like horse, and I have a shade cloth that barely covers my wash tub. What I do not have is spare anything for a man Hiram Voss threw out for shorting a job. I did not short the job. I did not say you did. I said that is the story, and stories are what people have instead of truth out here. She wrung the shirt and hung it on a line strung between 2 stakes. Why do you not walk to Daggett? $3 for passage, $2.13 in my pocket. Then earn the difference. Hiram told the teamsters I short work. Cora stopped ringing. She looked at him for the first time, measuring something. Then you had better figure out what you are going to do, because feeling sorry about it costs the same as canvas, and you cannot afford either. She went back to her washing. Rostam tried a brush ramada next. He cut creosote branches with his dull knife and lashed them into a frame using strips torn from his blanket's edge. It took a full day. The shade it cast was thin and gapped, and by noon the temperature beneath it was only a few degrees less murderous than the open air. He lay under it with his mouth closed and his eyes shut, and felt the heat settle into his bones like something that had been waiting for him. That night he slept beside the dry river wash because the sand held less heat than the hardpan. He woke at dawn with grit between his teeth, his neck stiff, and a scorpion 2 inches from his ankle. He did not move until it crawled away. Then he sat up and looked at the camp in the distance. The shed roofs, the canvas flies, the supply frames, all built from lumber and cloth he could not buy, and understood that the conventional path was closed. Everything men used to survive summer in the Mojave required money, materials, or social standing. Rostam had none of these. The desert had not changed. He was the variable that needed to change. He walked east that morning, away from camp, following the edge of a dry wash toward the remnants of an old military earthwork. The Army had built mud and stone redoubts at several points near Camp Cady during the 1860s, low defensive walls meant to protect against raids that mostly never came. Most had crumbled, but one section, roughly 8 feet long and 3 feet thick, still stood in the lee of a low ridge where runoff had not reached it. Rostam sat in its shadow. The shadow was unremarkable. Every rock, every wall, every standing object in the desert cast shadow, but Rostam did not care about the shadow. He cared about the wall itself. He placed his right palm flat against the sunlit exterior face. The clay burned. He held it there until the pain made him pull away. Then he walked around to the shaded interior face and placed the same palm against it. Cool, not cold, not comfortable, but measurably, unmistakably cooler than the air around it. The sun had been striking the exterior since dawn, 5 hours of direct heat, and the interior face had not yet warmed. Rostam pressed harder. He closed his eyes. He was 9 years old again, standing in his father's courtyard in Yazd. Bahman the plasterer had built a storage room against the south wall of their compound, a small, thick-walled chamber with a white lime exterior and no windows. On a summer afternoon when the air outside shimmered and dogs lay panting in doorways, Bahman had taken his son's hand and placed it on the inside wall of the storage room. "Cool," young Rostam had said. "Not cool," his father corrected. "Slow. The sun is fast. The earth is slow. The sun struck this wall at dawn, and the heat is still traveling through. It will arrive inside tonight after dark, when the air is cool enough to carry it away again. By morning, the wall has forgotten the sun, and so the earth begins each day fresh." His father had pressed his own palm beside his son's. 2 hands on clay in a darkened room, the sound of dry wind outside, the smell of lime dust and sheep wool. Men who understand speed build with cloth and wood. Men who understand patience build with earth. A cloth wall answers the sun immediately, hot air, hot shade, hot sleep. An earth wall makes the sun wait, and a sun that must wait long enough will give up and leave its heat outside. Rostam opened his eyes. He was 26 and his father was dead, and he was kneeling beside a ruined military wall in the Mojave Desert with a burned palm and $2.13. But the wall under his hand was cool, and his father's lesson had not crumbled. The sun is fast. The earth is slow. Make the sun spend itself before it reaches you. The insight assembled itself not as inspiration but as engineering. Rostam did not need to keep the sun away. Canvas did that, and canvas failed because it also trapped the heat it caught. He did not need shade. Shade only delayed the air temperature, not the radiant heat from every hot surface nearby. What he needed was mass, weight, thickness. A wall so dense and so slow that the sun's heat could not travel through it in a single day. By the time the heat reached the inside face, the desert night would pull it back out from the exterior. Every morning the wall would start over, and the sun would lose again. But a thick wall required material. Adobe bricks took forms, labor, curing time, and water. Weeks of work he did not have. Stone required cutting tools and hauling strength. Timber was impossible. What did he have? He had the desert floor, clay in the washbanks, sand everywhere, and behind Hiram's supply shed, in a refuse heap that even Hiram did not guard, a pile of ruined burlap grain sacks, split seams, mouse-chewed corners, flour-stained and oil-marked, worthless for freight, worthless for sale, not worthless to a plasterer's son. Rostam saw it clearly, long tubes of burlap, stitched shut with his awl and filled with damp clay, coiled in a circle like the rings of a coiled pot. Each ring pressed onto the one below, tamped by foot, leaning inward course by course until the wall curved over itself and became a roof. No timber frame, no canvas, no nails. The burlap was not the wall. It was the form, the hands holding the mud until the mud hardened and held itself. A dome. Low, thick, windowless, and squat. White on the outside with a caliche lime wash scraped from the pale alkaline banks east of camp. Dark inside. One low entrance facing north, away from the worst sun angles. A removable plug at the top for night venting, sealed before dawn. And a sleeping pit dug 3 feet into the earth at the center, where the temperature was coolest and most stable. The design existed nowhere in America, but it had existed for centuries in Yazd, in the wind towers and ice houses, and thick-walled storage rooms that kept men alive in summers as brutal as any the Mojave could deliver. Rostam's father had not built domes, but he had understood the principle behind them, and the principle did not care what shape it wore. Rostam pulled his notebook from his bedroll and began sketching. A 12-foot interior circle, base wall 3 feet thick, wide enough that the sun's heat would need most of a day to reach the interior, inward lean beginning at hip height, short and squat, not tall, because a tall dome caught wind and cracked under its own weight. Total height perhaps 7 feet at the center, enough to stand in the middle if he ducked near the walls. He calculated materials, roughly 60 to 80 sacks for the full coil, depending on length. Clay enough to fill them, boron, available from the wash, free, requiring only labor and water to dampen. Caliche for the whitewash, available from the pale banks, free. Cactus mucilage for plaster binding, available from prickly pear stands near the wash, free. Total cash cost, whatever he spent replacing his dull knife if it broke. Total labor cost, everything he had. Cora Pike found him at the refuse heap the next morning. He was squatting beside a pile of ruined sacks, sorting them by condition, repairable, usable as is, and too far gone. His sewing awl lay across his knee, and a length of jute twine hung from his teeth. "What are you doing with Hiram's trash?" Cora asked. "Hiram threw them out. They're no one's trash." "You are sewing grain sacks." "I am sewing tubes." "Tubes for what?" Rostam held up a finished length, a burlap sleeve roughly 4 inches in diameter and 6 feet long, stitched shut at one end. "I fill this with wet clay. I coil it in a circle. Each ring sits on the last. The wall rises." Cora stared at the tube, then at him, then at the pile of ruined sacks. "If cloth rots," she said, "does your roof come down with it?" Rostam paused. It was the first intelligent question anyone had asked him. Not a dismissal, not a joke, a structural question. "The sacks are not the wall," he said. "They are the hands that hold the mud while it dries. Once the clay sets, the burlap is inside the wall. It can rot. The clay does not care. And if it rains? I coat the outside with plaster, caliche and clay and cactus water, white, smooth, hard. Rain runs off. And the inside? You just sit in a mud ball in the dark? The dark is the point. No windows, no light holes except the vent at the top, and that closes during the day. The wall stays cool because the sun cannot reach the inside before night takes the heat back." Cora crossed her arms. "How do you know this works? Have you built one?" "No. Has anyone? My father understood the walls. I understand the shape. No one has built this exact thing. So you are testing an idea you have never tested with materials you pulled from a trash heap because a dead man in Persia told you mud was slow." Rostam set another sack on his knee and began stitching. "Yes." Cora watched him stitch for a full minute without speaking. Then she said, "I still think you're going to die out here, but at least you're doing something about it." She walked away. She did not offer help. She did not offer encouragement. But she also did not tell Hiram what Rostam was building, and in a camp where gossip traveled faster than freight, that silence was the closest thing to kindness Rostam had received since his expulsion. The gossip found its own way. By the 3rd day of stitching and hauling clay, 2 cavalrymen had stopped to watch. By the 4th day, The story had reached Hiram's porch. By the fifth day, the phrase had crystallized into the form it would keep for weeks. The Persian is sowing dirt. It passed from teamster to cavalry corporal to mule skinner to cook. Each telling added a layer of amusement. The Persian was sowing dirt. The Persian was building a mud hut with grain sacks. The Persian thought he could live in a clay ball like a desert toad. Hiram Voss heard the talk and recognized something beyond comedy. He recognized a threat. If Rostam survived without canvas, without timber, without Hiram's water tickets or Hiram's credit ledger, then every man at Camp Cady would see that survival was possible without Hiram. The debt papers in Hiram's vest pocket were worth exactly as much as men believed they had no other choice. Hiram decided to make the lesson public. He brought Lieutenant Pollard and Corporal Rafe Belden past the build site on the 6th day. The base circle was laid, a thick ring of clay-packed burlap on the desert floor, 12 feet across, white with alkaline dust. It looked, from a distance, like someone had drawn a circle in the dirt and filled it with mud sausages. Belden laughed first. He had the kind of laugh that carried the laugh of a man who performed for an audience. "What in God's name is that?" Hiram waited for the laugh to finish. Then he delivered his line with the precision of a man who had rehearsed it. "That is not a house, Corporal. That is a clay beehive for a man who thinks he is a bee." Belden laughed harder. Pollard did not laugh, but he did not contradict Hiram either. Hiram leaned forward in his saddle. He wanted Rostam to hear. He wanted everyone to hear. "No. Bees make honey. This one is making his own oven." The words hung in the hot air. Rostam knelt beside the base wall with a sack of damp clay across his thighs. His hands were brown with mud to the wrists. His shirt was dark with sweat. He heard every word. He did not answer. He did not look up. He lifted the sack, pressed it into the curve of the coil, and tamped it with his heel. Then he checked the inward lean with a string tied to a center stake, a plumb system he had rigged from a rock and a piece of twine. Hiram watched the silence and understood it as defiance, which made him angrier than an argument would have. That evening, Hiram adjusted the water price. Rostam, who had been buying water at the standard rate of 10 cents per gallon from the camp barrel, was informed that the rate for independent contractors not in good standing was 20 cents per gallon. Double. The announcement was made in front of 3 teamsters so there could be no misunderstanding. 20 cents per gallon. Rostam used roughly 2 gallons per day for drinking and another gallon and a half for dampening clay. 3.5 gallons per day. 70 cents per day at the new rate. His entire savings would last 3 days. The math closed like a fist. Rostam found the seep on his second night of looking. A shallow, brackish trickle at the base of a gravel bank roughly half a mile from camp, where underground moisture surfaced in a depression not much larger than a wash basin. The water was silty, alkaline tasting, and barely enough to fill his cracked jar twice in a night. But it was free, and free was the only price he could afford. He hauled water at night, filling his jar, carrying it back, dumping it into a shallow pit he had dug beside the build site, and returning for more. Each round trip took 40 minutes. He could manage 3 trips before dawn, which gave him roughly 4.5 gallons, enough for drinking and clay work if he was careful. But the cost was sleep. 2 hours lost each night, 2 hours his body needed and would not forgive. By the 7th morning, the wall had reached knee height. Rostam's palms were raw from handling wet burlap. The coarse weave had worn the skin between his thumb and forefinger into a bloody seam that reopened every time he gripped a filled sack. He wrapped his hands in strips torn from the blanket's edge, but the wrapping grew sodden with clay water and slipped. He kept working. 3 courses laid, 12 feet across. The wall leaned inward at an angle so slight it was invisible unless measured. But Rostam measured every course, every sack. The string and stone plumb hung from the center stake, and he checked it before pressing each new tube into place. If the lean was too shallow, the dome would never close. If the lean was too steep, the upper courses would slide inward and collapse. The desert did not wait. By late May, the daily temperature had crossed 108 in the shade. By early June, it would pass 115. The first sustained heat wave, 3 or more consecutive days above 120, could arrive any time after the middle of June. Rostam had perhaps 3 weeks, perhaps less. 3 weeks to build a structure no one had built before, for materials no one had used this way before, with skills no one believed he possessed. 3 weeks with bleeding hands, stolen sleep, and double-priced water. If you have ever built something that everyone around you said was impossible, if you have ever worked in silence while the laughter carried across the open ground, tell us in the comments. Because Rostam Bahmani was about to find out whether silence was enough. The 8th morning brought the first crack, a finger-wide split running diagonally across the south face of the base wall, where the afternoon sun hit hardest and the clay dried fastest. Rostam saw it at dawn when the low light caught the shadow in the fascia, and his stomach dropped. A cracked wall was not a failed wall, not yet. But a crack that widened would become a channel for heat, a weak point in the structure's mass, and eventually a fracture line where an entire section could shear away. In Yazd, his father had a saying about cracks. A crack is a question. If you answer it today, it costs labor. If you answer it tomorrow, it costs the wall. Rostam did not know how to answer it. His father had used lime and clay slip worked into scored joints, but the technique required knowing this desert's specific clay, how it shrank, how fast it dried, what mix held, and what mix crumbled. Rostam knew the theory. He did not know this particular dirt. He stared at the crack and felt the doubt that Pollard had planted settle deeper into his chest. Maybe mud did turn into a stove out here. Maybe the Mojave clay was too sandy, too alkaline, too different from the clay his father had known. Maybe the whole idea was a plasterer's son's fantasy, built from a dead man's lessons that did not translate to a desert that played by different rules. The wall was knee-high, the sun was climbing, and the first crack had already arrived. Rostam spent that morning on his knees beside the crack, pressing damp clay into the fissure with his thumbs and watching it dry. Within an hour, the patch had pulled away from the edges. The new clay shrank faster than the old, and the gap reopened like a mouth refusing to close. He tried again with wetter clay. It held longer but slumped out of the crack under its own weight. He tried a third time with clay mixed with fine sand scraped from the wash bank. The texture was different, grittier, less smooth, but it gripped the crack walls and held. By noon, the patch had dried without pulling free, though whether it would survive the next cycle of sun and cool was a question he could not answer until morning. That night, hauling water in the dark, he passed within 30 yards of a campfire where 2 teamsters sat drinking. He heard his name, not Rostam, but the Persian, and the word oven, and laughter that sounded like rocks dropping into a tin bucket. He kept walking. The jar on his shoulder weighed 7 pounds full. His left hand was wrapped in a blood-spotted strip of blanket. The seep was still 20 minutes ahead. By the 9th day, the wall had reached mid-thigh height. 5 courses of packed burlap tubes, each tamped and checked and measured. The south face crack had held. But a new problem emerged. The clay on the east side, which caught the first morning sun, dried so quickly that the surface hardened before the interior cured. The result was a shell of brittle clay over soft, wet clay, a crust that would crack the moment weight pressed on it from above. Rostam needed help, not labor. He could manage the lifting and hauling alone, though his body was beginning to charge interest on the debt. He needed knowledge. Specifically, he needed someone who understood how Mojave clay behaved, how fast it dried in layers, and what tricks held joints together in a desert that pulled moisture from everything it touched. He did not find that person. That person found him. Cora Pike sent Mateo Chacon. She did not announce it as charity. She did not explain her reasoning. She told Rostam later that she had watched him check the plumb line for the 5th time on the 9th morning and thought, that man is not guessing. And then she had walked to the old adobe workers' camp east of the garrison and told Mateo there was a foreigner building a mud dome who measured like a craftsman but did not know the local dirt. Mateo Chacon was 59 years old. He had been born near Hermosillo in Sonora, apprenticed to a mason at 12, and crossed into California during the gold rush not to mine, but to build. He had worked on mission repairs at San Gabriel, military outbuildings at Fort Yuma, and civilian adobes in half a dozen settlements that had since dried up and blown away. He had one clouded eye, the left, damaged by lime splash 20 years earlier, and a limp from a scaffold fall that had healed crooked. He had no patience for foolish pride, no tolerance for sloppy work, and no interest in men who talked about building instead of building. He arrived at the dome site on the morning of the 10th day, walking with a mesquite staff and carrying a leather pouch that clinked with tools. He did not introduce himself. He stood at the edge of the base circle and looked at the wall for a long time. Then he walked the full circumference, touching the clay at intervals, pressing his thumb into joints, running his fingers along the top course. He crouched at the south face crack repair and studied it. He stood at the east side and flicked the brittle crust with his fingernail. It rang hollow. "Who taught you to build?" Mateo asked. "My father, in Yazd." "Where is Yazd?" "Persia." Mateo nodded slowly. He crouched again and picked up a handful of loose clay from the work pile. He rolled it between his palms into a worm the thickness of a pencil, then held it horizontal and let it bend under its own weight. It cracked after about 3 inches of droop. "Too muchite," Mateo said. "Hematite, calcium in the alkaline soil." "This clay wants to be powder, not wall. You need finer silt mixed in. Red wash clay from the bank on the south side of the wash, a 1/4 part to 3 parts of what you're using. That changes the shrink." Rostam stared at him. Mateo delivered this information the way a man tells another man that his horse is lame, matter-of-factly, without ceremony, without waiting for gratitude. "The east side," Rostam said, "it dries too fast on the surface. Because you are laying in the morning. The sun hits it immediately and bakes the outside before the inside can move. Lay the east courses in the evening, lay the west courses in the morning. Let the shadow side cure first." It was so simple that Rostam almost laughed. Timing. Not different clay, not different technique. Timing. Work with the sun's schedule, not against it. "You know why?" Mateo said. He straightened up, and his bad knee made a sound like a green branch bending. "You do not yet know how this dirt behaves here. Will you teach me?" Mateo looked at the dome base. He looked at the string and stone plumb hanging from the center stake. He looked at the notebook wedged under a rock beside the work pile, open to a page of measurements and sketches. "Cora said you measure like a craftsman. I see she was right." He set his leather pouch on the ground and opened it. Inside were a wooden float, a plastering hawk, 2 steel scoring tools, and a ball of cord. "I do not work for free. I do not work for credit. I work because work that deserves finishing should be finished. And this," he gestured at the base circle, "this deserves finishing." 3 skills arrived over the next 4 days. each taught through Mateo's hands before Rostam's hands repeated them. The first was soil testing. Mateo showed Rostam how to read clay by touch. Roll a damp worm and watch where it cracks. If it cracks within 2 inches, the clay has too much ite or sand, add finer silt. If it smears before cracking, too much silt, add sand. If it holds to 4 inches and breaks clean, it is ready. Rostam tested 7 different clay sources from within a half-mile of the site before finding the mix Mateo approved. 3 parts gray wash clay to 1 part red bank, silt to a half part fine sand. The worm held to 4.5 inches and broke with a clean snap. The second skill was crack prevention. Mateo did not wait for cracks to appear and then repair them. He scored each course with a flat tool, cutting shallow lines through the surface while the clay was still damp, creating controlled flex points where the clay could shrink without tearing. Then he worked a thin slip, clay thin to the consistency of cream, into the scored lines and over the joints between courses. A crack chooses where to go, Mateo said, drawing his scoring tool across the damp surface. If you give it a road, it follows the road. If you do not, it makes its own, and its own is always worse. The third skill was whitewash layering. The caliche lime wash that would coat the dome's exterior was not paint to be slapped on. It was armor. Applied too thick, it cracked and peeled. Applied in noon heat, the surface dried before it bonded to the clay beneath, creating a shell that would flake off in the first wind. Mateo's method: thin coats applied at dawn, when the clay was coolest and most willing to absorb. 3 coats over 3 mornings. Each coat dried slowly enough to grip the one below. The result was a hard, bright, heat-reflecting skin that turned the dome from brown to blinding white. Never in noon heat, Mateo said, watching Rostam apply the first test coat to a section of base wall. Noon makes the surface a liar. It looks dry. It is not bonded. The first rain takes it like paper. Rostam applied the coat at dawn. By evening, it had bonded smooth and hard. He pressed his thumbnail into it, and it did not mark. Mateo watched and said nothing, which was his highest form of approval. The dome rose. Each day brought measurable progress and measurable cost. Day 11, the wall reached waist height. Rostam's clay mix, adjusted with Mateo's formula, held without cracking. But his water-hauling schedule, 3 trips per night to the seep, had carved dark hollows under his eyes. He moved more slowly. He dropped a filled sack on day 11 and had to restitch it, losing an hour. Day 12. The inward lean became visible. The wall no longer rose straight. It curved, each course set a finger width closer to center than the one below. From outside, the dome looked like a low white bowl tipped upside down, still open at the top. From inside, standing in the center, Rostam could see the sky through the narrowing ring above him, blue and merciless. Mateo arrived every morning and stayed until noon. He would not work past noon because he said a man who worked in afternoon Mojave sun was not dedicated but stupid, and stupidity killed more builders than bad clay. But in those morning hours, he worked beside Rostam with a precision that made his age irrelevant. His hands knew things his body had forgotten. He could feel a sack that was packed too loosely by pressing the back of his wrist against it. He could tell when a course was drifting off level by sighting along the top edge with his clouded eye, which he claimed saw curves better than the good one. They did not talk much while working. Mateo spoke in instructions and corrections, and Rostam listened and adjusted. But during the water break at mid-morning, they talked. Mateo had come to California in 1849, not as a miner, but as a builder. "Gold is a fever," he said. "It burns and passes. Adobe is a trade. It stands. He had built walls for men who struck gold and men who went broke. The walls outlasted both. He had married a woman from a mission community near San Gabriel, raised 2 sons, lost his wife to cholera, and drifted into the desert because the coast reminded him of her. He did not say this with self-pity. He said it the way he said everything, as fact, tested and proven, not requiring sympathy. "Why did you come to see this dome?" Rostam asked on the 12th morning. Mateo drank from his canteen and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Cora told me a man was measuring. Measuring means thinking. I wanted to see if the thinking was sound." "Is it?" "The thinking is sound. The building needs work. That is what I am here for." On the 13th day, Hiram's men stole 3 empty sacks from the edge of the work site. Rostam discovered them missing in the morning. The pile was shorter by 3, and boot prints led back toward the camp. He said nothing. He walked to Hiram's refuse heap and collected replacements, but these were poorer quality, or thinner, more mouse-eaten, harder to stitch into tubes that held their shape. Mateo saw the thinner sacks and understood immediately. "Someone is taking your material." "Hiram." "Then stitch tighter. Weaker sacks need stronger seams." He showed Rostam a double-back stitch that used twice the thread, but created a seam that held even when the burlap tore around it. "The sack can fail. The seam cannot." The dome continued to rise. Each course narrowed the opening above. Each course increased the danger. On the 14th day, Rostam set a course too quickly. The clay was still soft from the previous night's lay, and the weight of the new sack compressed the lower course beyond its tolerance. The inner edge of the wall bulged inward, a slow, heavy slump that Rostam felt through his feet before he saw it. He jumped back. The sack he had just placed slid sideways and dropped into the interior, landing where his feet had been a second earlier. 40 pounds of wet clay hitting packed earth with a sound like a body falling. Mateo, standing outside, heard the impact and came around to the entrance gap. He looked at the bulge, looked at the fallen sack, looked at Rostam. "Too fast," was all he said. Rostam's hands were shaking. Not from fear of the weight. 40 pounds would have bruised him, not killed him. But from fear of what the slump meant. If one course could compress the one below, then the upper courses, the ones that would carry the most curve, the most lean, the most gravitational stress, could collapse the entire structure inward. "I need to let each course cure longer," Rostam said. "Yes." "That means more days." "Yes." Rostam looked at the sky, cloudless. The air was already shimmering at mid-morning. They were in early June. The heat was climbing, each day hotter than the last. "How many more days?" Mateo picked up the fallen sack, hefted it, and set it outside the wall. "Each course needs 1 full night before you lay the next. At this height, 2 nights for the upper courses. You have perhaps 14 courses remaining before you can begin closing. 14 courses. At 1 per day, 14 days. At 1 every 2 days for the upper section, longer, 3 weeks at minimum. And the first sustained heat wave could arrive in 2 weeks. Perhaps less. The math was not complicated. It was once again nearly fatal. "I cannot wait 2 nights per course," Rostam said. "Then your dome falls, and you are inside it." "What if I lay 2 courses per day on opposing sides, east in the morning, west in the evening? Each side cures while I work the other." Mateo considered this. He walked to the wall, pressed his thumb into the top course, and studied the impression. If the clay is mixed right, if you do not overpack, if the weather holds dry. He paused. If you're lucky." "I have not been lucky." "No," Mateo said. "You have been stubborn. Stubborn is better than lucky. Lucky runs out." Rostam adopted the alternating schedule: east courses at dawn, west courses at dusk, midday for water hauling to replace the night trips, which gave him back 2 hours of sleep. The schedule worked. Each side cured while the opposite side was being laid, and the dome rose faster. 2 courses per day instead of 1, with each course getting 16 hours of setting time instead of the 12 a single-side schedule would allow. By day 16, the dome had reached chest height. The curvature was unmistakable now. The walls leaned inward at a steady angle, each course a full finger width closer to center. From outside, the structure looked like a white egg sinking into the desert, its top open to the sky. From inside, the opening above had narrowed to perhaps 8 feet across. The air in the lower interior was already noticeably cooler than outside, not because the dome was finished, but because the thick walls shaded the floor, and the sunken area Rostam had begun excavating held the previous night's cool. Lieutenant Pollard reappeared. He rode past the site on a supply inspection and stopped. He had not seen the dome since it was a base ring on the ground. Now it was a chest-high white plastered structure with visible curvature and a man-sized entrance gap facing north. Pollard sat his horse and studied it for a long time. "You are still here," he said. "I am still here. And you are still building with mud." Rostam was applying whitewash to the newest course, working the thin lime mixture into the clay with Mateo's wooden float. The float made a scraping sound that set Pollard's horse shifting. "The wall feels cool on the inside," Rostam said. He did not say it as a boast. He said it as a report, the way Pollard himself delivered information, flat, factual, available for inspection. "At this height, shade alone could account for that," Pollard said. "Test it." Pollard dismounted. He tied his horse to a creosote bush and walked to the dome. He placed his palm on the exterior, the south-facing section that had been in direct sun since dawn. He pulled it away quickly. "Hot," he said. "Now inside." Pollard ducked through the north-facing gap and stood in the interior. The space was dim. The only light came from the open top in the entrance. He placed his palm on the interior wall, the same south-facing section from the inside. He held it there for 5 seconds. 10 seconds. His face changed. "That is not shade," he said quietly. "No. That is 3 feet of earth between the sun and your hand. The heat is still in the outer layer. It will not reach the inside until tonight, and tonight the air will carry it away." Pollard withdrew his hand and looked at the wall as if seeing it for the first time. Then he looked at Rostam. The expression was not admiration. It was reassessment. The look of a man whose categories had shifted. "How thick is the base?" 3 feet at the bottom. It will narrow as it curves, but the thinnest point at the top will still be 18 inches. "And the whitewash?" "Reflects the sun. Less heat enters the wall to begin with." Pollard looked at the smooth white surface, then up at the open top where the sky blazed through. He put his hat back on and stepped out through the entrance. "If that roof drops," he said, "I will not order men to dig you out until morning." "I understand." Pollard mounted his horse. He sat there for a moment, looking at the dome, then at the camp, then back at the dome. Then he rode away without another word. He had not praised it. He had not endorsed it. But he had touched the inside wall, and he had felt what Rostam's father had taught Rostam to feel 20 years ago in a courtyard in Yazd. The earth was slow. The sun had spent itself on 3 feet of clay and had nothing left to show on the other side. Whether that would hold when the real heat arrived was the question Pollard carried back to camp, and the question the desert itself would answer. The dome closed on the 18th day. Not easily, not cleanly. The final courses were the most dangerous work Rostam had ever done. Above chest height, the inward lean became aggressive. Each course projected further towards center, and the wet clay's weight pulled the unsupported inner edge downward. A course that was too heavy slumped. A course that was too thin cracked. The margin between the two was a matter of ounces, and Rostam measured each sack by feel, pressing it between his palms, judging the pack density, adjusting by adding or removing handfuls of clay before stitching the end shut. Matteo stood outside the dome for the upper courses, unwilling to be inside a structure whose top might fall. He guided Rostam by voice, calling corrections through the entrance gap. Left side is heavy. Pull the seam tighter. Set it down. Now tamp. Lighter on the tamp. Lighter. On the 17th day, the opening above Rostam had narrowed to 4 feet across. He was placing the final courses by reaching overhead, pressing each sack into the curve with his forearms, and holding it until the clay gripped the course below. His shoulders burned. Clay water ran down his arms and dripped from his elbows. He could not see the top clearly because the interior was dim and his eyes were full of grit. Matteo forced him to stop and lower the dome profile. Rostam had been building taller than planned, perhaps 8 feet at the center instead of 7. Because some part of him wanted the space, the dignity of a room a man could stand in without ducking. Matteo killed that dignity on the 17th afternoon. A proud roof falls faster, Matteo said from outside the entrance. Drop the next 2 courses 6 inches from where you planned them. You lose headroom. You keep your life. Rostam argued. He wanted the height. He had earned the height. You earned nothing until the last sack holds, Matteo said. Earn the height on your second dome. Survive this one. Rostam lowered the profile. The dome would top out at 7 feet, maybe 6.5. A man could stand in the center if he was not tall. Rostam was not tall. The final sack, the keystone tube, went in on the 18th morning. Rostam placed it from inside the dome, reaching directly overhead. He packed it into the last gap, tamped it with his palm, and held it. His arms shook. Clay dropped onto his face. Matteo's voice from outside. Is it holding? Rostam pressed harder. He felt the clay grip. The tube settled into the courses on either side, compressing, locking. The weight equalized. He let go slowly, 1 finger at a time. It held. The dome was closed. A smooth, unbroken curve of clay-packed burlap, white on the outside, dark on the inside, with a removable plug of wrapped clay at the very top for night venting and a low north-facing entrance barely 3 feet high. From outside, it looked like an enormous white mound set against the desert floor, too low to be a house, too smooth to be a hut, too windowless to seem livable. The army men called it the egg. Hiram's men called it the oven. Cora Pike, who had watched its progress without commenting, called it nothing. She simply stopped predicting Rostam's death, which was its own kind of validation. From inside, the dome was another world. Rostam knelt through the entrance and stood in the center. The air was different. Not just cooler, denser, heavier, the kind of air that sits still because nothing disturbs it. The walls breathed in the way thick walls always breathe, a slow exchange of moisture and temperature that makes the air feel inhabited, even when no one else is present. The floor, which he had dug 3 feet down in the center to create a sleeping pit, was cooler still. He pressed his palm against the sunken earth and felt the night trapped there. The hours of darkness held in the ground like a reserve. Light entered only through the entrance and the roof plug. With the plug closed and the entrance draped with a dampened sack, the interior was nearly dark. That darkness was not a flaw. It was the mechanism. Light carried heat. Darkness kept it out. The dome was not a building. It was a question posed to the sun. Can you push your way through 3 feet of earth, past a white shell that reflects you, through 18 inches of packed clay at the top, and into a room that refuses to let you in? The answer so far was no. Rostam borrowed Pollard's army thermometer for the first readings. Pollard did not lend it willingly, but he did not refuse either. He handed it through the dome entrance and told Rostam to bring it back by evening. The numbers. Outside shade temperature at noon, 109 degrees. South exterior dome surface, too hot to touch. The thermometer, held against the plaster, climbed past 130 before Rostam pulled it away. Main interior chamber, standing height, 82 degrees. Sunken sleeping pit at dawn, 65 degrees. Sunken sleeping pit at late afternoon, 71 degrees. The pit temperature at dawn confirmed the principle. After a full night of venting, roof plug open, entrance open, the hot air rising through the dome throat and cool night air pooling in the pit, the lowest point in the structure reached 65 degrees. 65. In a desert where the shade temperature would soon exceed 120. But Pollard distrusted the numbers, and he was right to distrust them. The dome had been tested on a single day, and not the worst day. The shade temperature of 109 was hot by any human standard, but the Mojave's full summer wrath would push past 115, past 120, into territory where the air itself felt solid with heat. The question was not whether the dome worked on a warm day. The question was whether the dome worked on the worst day, and then the day after that, and the day after that. Thermal mass helps only if the night can pull the heat back out, Mateo said, standing outside the dome with his arms crossed. If the nights stay hot, really hot, the walls store more heat each day than they release. After 3 days, 4 days, the inside starts climbing. The mass works against you. Then I open the vent every night and close it before dawn. If the vent jams, if dust fills it, if you're sick? Rostam did not answer. He had built the removable plug from a clay disc wrapped in doubled burlap, fitted snugly into the opening. It worked, but works and works when everything goes wrong were different statements, and the desert tested the second one. Hiram heard the temperature numbers, gossip again, carried from Pollard's men to the teamsters to the camp at large, and sharpened his mockery. He stood on his porch that evening and delivered his verdict to anyone within earshot. A man can be cool in a coffin too, Hiram said. You want to live in a hole in the ground with no window and no light? That is your choice. A Christian man wants air and daylight and a proper roof. Corporal Belden, standing nearby, added, What happens when it rains? That thing wash away like a dirt clod? The laughter was thinner than before. The temperature numbers had made some men curious rather than dismissive. But curiosity was not belief, and Hiram's authority still outweighed Rostam's clay. The dust storm arrived 6 days after the dome closed. It came from the east on a Tuesday afternoon, announced by a brown wall of grit that swallowed the mountains and turned the sky the color of rust. Wind hit first, a dry, tearing wind that pulled at canvas and knocked loose things sideways. Then the sand. Fine, alkaline dust that found every gap in every structure, every seam in every tent, every opening in every shed. Rostam sealed the dome entrance with the damp sack and closed the roof plug. Inside, the air grew still and strange, dim, sealed, the sound of the storm reduced to a muffled roar like a distant river. Fine dust seeped in around the entrance drape, but the interior remained breathable. The walls did not shake. 3 feet of packed earth did not move in wind. Outside, Hiram's supply shed lost a shutter. Pollard's men chased tarps across the hardpan. A teamster's canvas fly ripped at the grommets and wrapped itself around a wagon wheel, but the dome held. The problem came after. Sand packed the roof vent plug so tightly that Rostam could not remove it from inside. The clay disc, designed to lift out, was jammed by grit wedged into the joint. Without the vent, the dome could not flush hot air at night. Without night flushing, the walls would begin accumulating heat. 2 days without venting, and the interior temperature would climb past 90. 3 days, and the advantage was gone. Rostam climbed the dome at dusk. The exterior was still warm from the day. He scrambled up the curved surface on hands and knees, his boots slipping on the smooth whitewash, and reached the top. The plug was visible as a slightly raised disc at the dome's crown. He gripped its edges and pulled. Sand grated. The plug did not move. He pulled harder, twisting. His right boot slipped on the whitewash and his body swung sideways. His left hand held the plug edge. His right hand caught the dome surface and slid, tearing a strip of skin from his forearm on the rough plaster. Blood ran down his wrist and dripped onto the white shell. He steadied himself. He pulled again. The plug broke free with a gritty pop, and hot air exhaled from the dome's interior, a column of warm breath rising into the cooling desert evening. Rostam slid down the dome side and sat at the base, pressing his torn forearm against his shirt. The wound was not deep, but it bled freely, and he had nothing clean to bind it with. Cora Pike appeared. She had been watching from her wash station, though she would never have said so. She stitched the wound with lamp thread and a curved needle she kept in her apron for mending harness leather. She did not ask permission. She did not offer sympathy. She stitched the way she did everything, efficiently, without wasted motion, without commentary. "You should have cleared that plug before climbing," she said, tying off the last stitch. "I did not know it was jammed until I tried." "You climbed a round mud building at dusk without checking first." "Yes." Cora looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, not softness, but a recalculation. The same look Pollard had worn inside the dome. The look of someone revising a judgment they had already made. "I have coffee sacks," she said. "Torn. I was saving them for mattress stuffing. Jute. Thicker than your grain sacks." Rostam looked at her. "I still think you are building a tomb," Cora said. "But if you are, build it straight." She brought 7 jute coffee sacks the next morning. Rostam used them to reinforce the entrance arch, which had developed hairline cracks from the dome's settling weight. The jute was heavier, stiffer, and held its shape better than the grain burlap. It was the best material he had worked with since the project began. He did not thank Cora in words. He thanked her by building the entrance arch so cleanly that Mateo, arriving that morning, ran his hand over the joint and said, "That is jute." "Cora Pike." Mateo smiled, a rare event, brief as a match flare. "She sees what she sees." The days after the dust storm brought the first true heat, not the building heat of late May and early June, the real heat, the Mojave heat that men who had survived it described with a reverence usually reserved for God and gunfire. The thermometer climbed past 110 in shade, past 112, past 115. The air stopped moving. The ground radiated heat upward like a stoveplate. Metal tools left in the sunburned skin on contact. Horses stood with their heads down, breathing through flared nostrils, refusing to eat until after dark. The dome's interior readings held. 84 degrees in the main chamber at the hottest hour. 70 degrees in the sleeping pit at dawn. The walls were doing exactly what Rostam's father had described, absorbing the day's heat slowly, releasing it at night, and starting fresh each morning. The The white shell reflected enough direct sun that the outer surface, while still hot, was cooler than any dark or uncoated surface nearby. And the darkness inside, the pure, windowless, light-sealed darkness, prevented radiant heating of the interior surfaces that would have made the air unbearable even if the walls stayed cool. Mateo tested the dome himself one afternoon, sitting inside for an hour with Pollard's thermometer. He emerged sweating. 84 degrees was not comfortable, but shaking his head in the way that meant he was satisfied. "You will want to open the entrance wider in the evening," he said. "When you unseal the vent, unseal the door at the same time. You need cross-draft, hot air up through the vent, cool air in through the door. The pit temperature drops faster." Rostam adjusted the ventilation routine. Open the vent and entrance at sundown. Leave both open through the night. Seal the entrance at dawn with the dampened sack. Seal the vent immediately after. Every morning, the dome started over. Mateo taught one more lesson during the pre-crisis days, and it was the one that would matter most. "Your dome is a single room," Mateo said. "One man fits. What happens when someone else needs shelter and you are not here?" "They enter." "And if two people need shelter? Three? A sick child?" Rostam had not thought past his own survival. The dome was built for one. The sleeping pit held one. The entrance admitted one person at a time. "Build the entrance with a bend," Mateo said. He drew in the dirt with his staff, an L-shaped passage instead of a straight tunnel. "A straight entrance lets light in. Light is heat. A bent entrance blocks the light but lets the air through. And," he tapped the drawing, "it creates a second cool space in the bend. A child could sleep there." Rostam looked at the existing entrance. Straight. A single slab of open space 3 feet wide and 3 feet tall, draped with a wet sack. Mateo was right. It leaked light and heat during the day when the drape shifted. "I cannot rebuild the entrance now." "No, but when you build the next dome, and there will be a next dome, remember the bend." Mateo stood and gathered his staff. His cough, which had been present since Rostam first met him, a dry, persistent sound like paper tearing, was worse in the afternoons. He waved it away when Rostam looked concerned. "I have had that cough since San Gabriel," he said. "It has not killed me yet. It is just dust." It was not just dust. Rostam could see the weight Mateo had lost since they began working together. The way he braced against his staff more heavily now. The way he sat instead of crouching. But Mateo did not invite concern, and Rostam did not offer it. They worked together the way men work together in hard places, with respect for the work and silence about the rest. And then the real test came. Late July. The heat wave that the desert had been building towards since May arrived, not as a single hot day, but as a siege. 3 days of brutal, unbroken heat, each worse than the last, followed by a 4th day that made the first 3 feel like rehearsal. Day 1. 117 in shade. The air felt thick, like breathing through heated cloth. Sweat evaporated so fast, it left salt crystals on skin. The camp moved in slow motion. Men walking between shade points, horses tied under canvas, no one working past 9 in the morning. Day 2. 119. 2 cavalry horses refused water, a sign of heat stress that made Pollard order all mounts into the shade corral and post a man to watch for colic. The ground shimmered so violently that a man looking south could not distinguish earth from sky. Canvas shade structures, which blocked direct sun but trapped radiated heat from the ground below, became barely tolerable. Day 3, 121 in Pollard's best shade, measured at 2 in the afternoon. The highest reading anyone at Camp Cady had recorded. Metal tools left in the sun burned through leather gloves. A teamster's oxen stood in the wash bed, ankle deep in the trickle of water that still ran and would not move. 2 cavalrymen showed signs of heat exhaustion, dizziness, nausea, skin hot and dry instead of sweaty. And then the 4th day. Pollard's thermometer, hanging in the shade of the best ventilated structure in camp, a double canvas fly with a raised floor, read 123 degrees at 1 in the afternoon. Pollard stared at the mercury and said nothing. There was nothing to say. 123 in shade meant 140 or more in direct sun. It meant the desert was no longer a place where men endured discomfort. It was a place where men died. The complication arrived with the heat. Eli Dobb was 15 years old. He was Hiram's hired boy, an orphan or near orphan, the kind of boy the frontier produced in quantity and consumed without sentiment. He hauled crates, swept the shed, and slept under the porch in exchange for meals and $1 a week that Hiram recorded in the ledger, but rarely paid in full. He was thin, sun-darkened, and quiet in the way that boys are quiet when speaking risks a cuff. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Eli collapsed while hauling a crate of tinned goods from the supply shed to the storage lean-to. He dropped straight down, the crate slamming beside him, cans rolling in the dust. He did not cry out. He simply stopped moving, like a watch spring that had unwound. Cora reached him first. She poured water on his neck and face. His skin was burning hot and dry. No sweat, which meant his body had stopped cooling itself. She looked at Hiram, who stood on the porch. "He needs shade. That is not this," Cora said, gesturing at the canvas fly. "Real shade. Cool air." "He needs water and rest," Hiram said. "Put him under the fly." "The fly is 112 degrees. I measured." "Then wet him down and wait." Cora knew what 112 degrees meant for a boy whose body had stopped sweating. She knew what wait meant. She looked across the camp toward the white mound that sat beyond the perimeter, low and windowless and silent in the glare. Hiram saw where she looked. "You are not taking him to that mud pile," Hiram said. "It is cooler in there than anywhere in this camp. It is a dirt hole built by a man who sews grain sacks. If the boy dies in there, it is on the Persian, not on me. If the boy dies under your fly, it is on you." The words landed in front of witnesses, Pollard, Belden, 2 teamsters. Hiram's face darkened. The authority that lived in his ledger and his water prices depended on control, and Cora had just challenged that control in public over a boy whose life mattered less to Hiram than the principal. If you are invested in what happens next, if you need to know whether the man who called the dome an oven will let a boy die to protect his pride, stay with us, because the next decision changes everything. Pollard settled it, not with authority, not with argument, but with action. He picked Eli up. The boy weighed nothing, all bone and burned skin, and carried him toward the dome. Cora followed. Hiram stood on the porch and watched them go, and his silence was louder than anything he had said all summer. Rostam saw them coming. He had been inside the dome since noon, sitting in the sleeping pit, conserving water and energy. The dome's main chamber read 78 degrees. The pit read 68. Outside, the world was burning. Pollard knelt through the entrance with Eli in his arms. Cora followed. They laid the boy in the sleeping pit on the packed earth, in the dark. Cora wet cloths from her canteen and pressed them to his neck, his wrists, his forehead. Eli's eyes were half open but unfocused. His breathing was shallow and fast. Rostam gave the pit to Eli and moved to the entrance, where the air was warmer but still 30 degrees cooler than outside. He sat with his back against the curved wall and watched. Mateo arrived within the hour. He said nothing about the boy. He entered the dome, touched the walls at 3 points, checked the vent plug, sealed tight, and sat down beside Rostam. His cough was bad. He pressed a cloth to his mouth, and it came away spotted. "The walls are holding," Matteo said quietly. "For now." For now is all any wall can promise. The hours passed. The heat outside peaked and held, a plateau of misery that did not relent as afternoon gave way to evening. The dome's interior temperature climbed. 78 degrees became 80 by late afternoon, but the rise was slow, gradual, measured in single degrees per hour. The thick walls were absorbing heat, as Matteo had warned, but they were absorbing it at the pace of earth, not air. The sleeping pit held at 68 because the ground beneath it had been cool all winter, all spring, and all of a summer that had not yet reached 3 feet down. At sundown, Rostam climbed outside. The roof plug was jammed again. Dust and clay expansion from the heat had wedged it tight. His palm, still bearing the scar from the last time, pressed against the disc's edge. He cut around the joint with his knife, working grit free, and pulled. The plug came loose. Hot air erupted from the dome, a visible column of warmth rising into the cooling evening like breath from a sleeping animal. He nearly passed out on the dome's crown. The climb, the exertion, the heat. His vision narrowed, and the white plaster swam beneath him. He pressed his forehead against the dome surface, which was still hot from the day, and waited. His pulse hammered in his ears. The scar on his forearm throbbed. He slid down. He opened the entrance. The cross-draft began, cool evening air flowing in through the door, hot air rising through the vent. The dome exhaled its stored heat like a man sighing after holding his breath. By midnight, the main chamber had dropped to 74. The pit had dropped to 66. Eli's skin was cooler. His eyes tracked movement. Cora fed him water by the sip. Too fast, and he would vomit, losing more than he gained. The fourth day dawned at 123 degrees and held. Pollard entered the dome in the morning. He brought his army thermometer. He hung it in the main chamber at head height and waited. Cora, Matteo, Eli, and Rostam sat in the dim space and watched the mercury settle. 76 degrees in the main chamber. Pollard moved the thermometer to the sleeping pit. They waited again. 66 degrees. He moved it once more, to the pit floor at Eli's level. 65 degrees. Pollard held the thermometer in front of his face and read it twice. Then he looked at Rostam. Then he looked at the walls. Thick, white, dark, silent. Then he removed his hat. He did not praise Rostam. He did not apologize. He removed his hat, which in Pollard's language was the largest gesture available. The air outside was 123 degrees. Metal-burned hands, horses stood with their heads down. Men sheltered under canvas that kept the sun off their shoulders but could not keep the heat from rising through the ground below them. Hiram's supply shed, plank walls, canvas roof, no mass, no insulation, was a box of stored heat where candles softened and flour smelled sour. And in a dome built from ruined grain sacks and desert clay, coated with scraped lime and sealed with darkness, the floor read 65 degrees, and a boy who had collapsed under the sun breathed steadily in the dark. Eli's breathing steadied fully before the next dawn. His skin cooled. He drank water and kept it down. By the fifth morning, when the heat wave finally broke, dropping to a mere 112 in shade, he sat up on his own and asked for food. Cora fed him broth she had prepared on her cook fire. She carried it into the dome in a tin cup, and the steam rose and vanished in the cool air. Matteo watched from the entrance, his cough quiet for once. his clouded eye reflecting the dim light from outside. Rostam sat against the wall and said nothing. He was exhausted beyond words. 4 days of crisis, 2 nights of climbing the dome to clear the vent, a torn forearm, dehydration, and the weight of other people's lives resting on walls he had built with his own bleeding hands. His body hurt in places he could not name, his eyes were hollowed, his lips were cracked. But the walls held. The earth was slow. The sun had spent itself on 3 feet of clay and 2 coats of lime, and the inside of the dome remained what Rostam's father had always said Earth could be, a place where men survived because the building was more patient than the weather. Pollard emerged from the dome into the morning glare and stood for a moment, blinking. Hiram Voss stood 40 yards away on his porch, watching. Pollard looked at Hiram. Hiram looked back. Neither man spoke. But every man in camp who saw that exchange understood what it meant. The man who had called the dome an oven had refused to let a dying boy enter it. The man who had built the dome with $2 and ruined sacks had given his coolest space away and sat by the door. The desert had tested the clay hive, and the clay hive had held. Whether the man who built it would be granted the credit he had earned was a different question, and the answer depended on forces more complicated than thermometers and lime wash. The crisis was over. The summer was not. And Hiram Voss, standing on his porch with his ledger in his hand and his authority crumbling in the heat, had not yet decided what kind of man he was going to be. The heat wave broke on the 5th morning, and the camp exhaled. Men who had been sleeping in shifts under soaked canvas stood upright and moved with something closer to purpose. Horses drank deeply. Pollard ordered his men back to regular duties. The thermometer dropped to 112, then 109, then 106 over 3 days, and 106 felt almost mild after 123. Eli Dobb walked out of the dome on his own legs on the 6th morning. He was thin and slow, but his eyes were clear and his skin had cooled. He stood blinking in the daylight, shading his face with one hand, and looked back at the low white mound he had spent 4 nights inside. He did not say anything profound. He was 15. He said, "It is bright out here." Cora laughed. It was the first time Rostam had heard her laugh, and it sounded like something that had been stored away for a long time and brought out carefully. Hiram Voss watched Eli cross the camp from the dome to the supply shed. He watched from his porch, ledger in hand, and the watching was its own kind of reckoning. Every man in camp had seen Eli carried into the dome. Every man had seen Eli walk out. The arithmetic was public and unforgiving. The structure Hiram had called an oven had kept a boy alive through the worst heat anyone could remember, and the shade structures Hiram sold on credit had failed. Hiram said nothing that morning. He said nothing that afternoon. His silence, which had always been a weapon, the quiet before a price increase, the pause before a debt demand, now felt different. It felt like a man standing in a room where the floor had shifted and he had not yet found his balance. Pollard found his balance first. He requested Rostam's presence at the quartermaster's tent on the 7th morning after the heat wave. It was not a social invitation. Pollard conducted himself with the formality of a supply officer, even in a camp that had largely abandoned formality, and he sat behind his folding table with a ledger open and a pencil in his hand. "I told you mud turns into a stove," Pollard said. "I said it on the day Voss put you out, and I said it in front of the men who heard me." Rostam stood on the other side of the table. He had washed his shirt for the first time in days, and the fabric was stiff with alkaline residue. His forearm was still bandaged with Cora's stitches. His hands, scarred and cracked from weeks of wet burlap, rested at his sides. "I was wrong," Pollard said. "Bad mud turns into a stove. Thin mud. Quick mud. The kind of wall that men build here because they do not know better or do not have the patience for better. He paused. What you built is not that. I do not understand all of it, but I understand the thermometer, and the thermometer says 65 degrees on the hottest day this camp has recorded. 65 in the pit, Rostam corrected. 76 in the main chamber. 76 is 30 degrees cooler than my best shade structure. The pit temperature is 58 degrees cooler. I have filed a note for the post record. Pollard opened his ledger to a clean page. I want you to explain the dome for the camp record. Construction method, materials, measurements, the principle behind the cooling. I want it written so that another quartermaster at another post could read it and understand. Rostam hesitated. His English was functional for speech, but stiff for writing. Technical terms came to him in Farsi first, and the translations were imprecise. Thermal mass was a concept he understood perfectly in his father's language, but could not express cleanly in Pollard's. I can explain, Rostam said. I am not certain I can write it in your language the way it needs to be written. Mateo stepped through the tent flap. He had been waiting outside, which meant Cora had told him about the meeting, which meant the camp's information network operated with more precision than Pollard's supply chain. I will translate the craft terms, Mateo said. He explains. I find the English words. You write them down. Pollard looked at Mateo, then at Rostam. He set his pencil on the table. Sit down, both of you. They sat. Rostam spoke. Mateo translated the concepts that had no clean English equivalents: the slow movement of heat through dense material, the relationship between wall thickness and delay time, the role of color in reflecting heat before it entered the wall, the function of darkness in preventing secondary heating of interior surfaces. Pollard wrote. His handwriting was small and square and methodical, the handwriting of a man who recorded supply counts and horse health with equal care. The session lasted 2 hours. When it was finished, Pollard had 3 pages of notes that described in military language what Rostam had built and why it worked. He titled the document Thick White Adobe Shelter of Unusual Performance, Construction Notes from the Builder, translated. He did not credit Rostam by name in the title. That was Army convention. The document belonged to the post, not the individual. But in the first line of the text, he wrote, the following method was developed and demonstrated by R. Bahmani, civilian laborer, Camp Cady, California. It was the first time Rostam's name had appeared in an official American document attached to something other than a labor record or a freight contract. Practical skeptic conversion came next, and it came the way practical conversions always come. Not through argument, but through need. Cora Pike arrived at the Dome on a Tuesday morning with a request. Not a question, not curiosity. A request delivered with the directness of a woman who had decided something and was not interested in discussing it. I want a wash shelter, she said. A what? A place to do laundry that is not 115 degrees. My soap melts. My starch turns liquid. The shirts dry before I can iron them, and they dry stiff as boards. I need shade that actually cools. You want a dome. I want a half dome, a wall, and a roof over my wash tub. I do not need to sleep in it. I need to work in it. Rostam looked at her. She was standing with her arms crossed, which was her default posture for conversation she intended to control. Her face was burned dark, and her hands were cracked from lye soap and desert air. A half dome is harder than a full dome, Rostam said. The curve does not support itself. You need a back wall. Then build a back wall. With what? I have used every sound sack in Hiram's refuse heap. Cora reached behind her and produced a bundle, 11 jute coffee sacks, better quality than the grain burlap, stitched into long tubes with a tight, clean seam. She had done the stitching herself at night by lamplight, using the double-back technique Matteo had taught Rostam. Rostam took the bundle and examined the seams. They were good. Not perfect. The tension varied in places, and one tube had a twist in the fabric that would pack unevenly, but good enough. Better than his earliest work. "You have been watching," he said. "I've been watching since you laid the first course. I watched you measure. I watched you test. I watched the old man teach you about cracks. I am not building a dome. I am building a wash shelter, but I am building it right." This was Cora's conversion, not a dramatic admission of error, not a tearful apology for her earlier skepticism. A practical woman with a practical need, applying practical observation to solve a practical problem. She had watched. She had learned. She had stitched tubes. And now she was standing in front of the man she had called a dead man walking, asking him to teach her to build. Rostam smiled. It was the first time he had smiled in weeks, and the expression felt unfamiliar on his face. "We will need to test your clay mix first." Matteo showed me. 3 parts gray, 1 part red silt, half part sand. I tested 4 batches last week. The worm holds to 4 inches. Rostam's smile widened. He looked at the bundle of sack tubes, at Cora's cracked hands, at the quiet certainty in her face. "We start tomorrow at dawn," he said. The community came in pieces after that. A freighter named Loomis, who hauled goods between Camp Cady and the Daggett Rail Junction, asked Rostam about building a small cool storehouse for water kegs. His barrels heated in transit, and warm water tasted of the wood and went sour faster. He wanted a structure just large enough for 4 barrels, with no entrance larger than necessary and a removable top for loading. Rostam drew the design in the dirt. A 6-foot circle, 2.5-foot walls, barrel vault top instead of a full dome to accommodate the rectangular loading pattern. The walls need to be 2 feet minimum. The top can be thinner because you will shade it with a cloth when loading. And what will it cost me? Labor, sacks, water for the clay, no money. Loomis stared at him. "Why no money?" Rostam paused. He had thought about this. He had thought about it since the night Matteo told him that craft survives only when given away, and since the longer night when he lay in the sleeping pit and wondered whether Americans would steal the idea and still despise him. "Because the design is not mine to sell," Rostam said. "It belongs to the desert and the clay. I can teach you to build it. I cannot own the principle." It was the kind of statement that sounded foolish to men who measured everything in ledger entries. But Loomis was a freighter, not a merchant, and freighters understood that some things, knowledge of water holes, the best route through sand, the places where axles broke, were shared freely because keeping them secret cost lives. "I will bring sacks," Loomis said. Pollard's request was different in character. He wanted a powder storage chamber, a cool, stable environment for storing ammunition and black powder through the summer. Heat degraded powder reliability, and the camp's current storage was a plank lean-to that reached 110 degrees by afternoon. "I can design it," Rostam said, "but I will not build near powder unless the army follows my rules." Pollard's eyebrows rose. "Your rules?" "No metal tools inside the chamber once powder is present. No fire within 20 yards. The vent plug must be checked every evening, and the walls must cure for 10 full days before anything is stored inside. Green clay holds moisture, and moisture near powder is worse than heat." Pollard considered this. He was not accustomed to taking instructions from civilian laborers, particularly civilian laborers who had been expelled from the camp's only supply operation. But he was accustomed to respecting competence when it proved itself under pressure, and Rostam's dome had proved itself at 123 degrees with a boy's life at stake. "Agreed," Pollard said. "My rules on the perimeter, your rules on the walls." Rostam nodded. It was, in its small way, the most significant professional exchange of his life in America. A military officer agreeing to follow the construction standards of a Persian immigrant mason. The agreement lasted as long as the powder store stood, and the powder store stood for 3 years after Pollard transferred out. Through all of this, Rostam taught the same way Matteo had taught him, through demonstration, through testing, through hands-on clay. He made each person who wanted to build start with a 1-foot model, a miniature dome built from cut-down sack tubes filled with clay, coiled on a flat stone. If the model cracked, they broke it and started over. If the model held, he examined the joints, the lean, the thickness. Only when the model satisfied him did he mark a full-size circle in the dirt. "Do not copy the shape," he told Loomis, who was sketching the water storehouse model. "Copy the reason. The shape changes with every building. The reason does not." Matteo, sitting on his mesquite staff in the shade of the dome, smiled at that. It sounded like a real teacher. It sounded like something Bahman the plasterer might have said in a courtyard in Yazd. The mentor relationship had changed. Through the early weeks of construction, Rostam had been the student and Matteo the authority. Now the balance had shifted. Rostam still deferred to Matteo on matters of local clay behavior and crack repair, but on the design principles, the thermal logic, the ventilation system, the relationship between wall thickness and heat delay, Rostam was the authority, and both men knew it. They talked about this one evening, sitting outside the dome in the brief window of comfortable temperature that arrived between the day's brutality and the night's chill. Matteo's cough was worse. He had stopped pretending it was dust. "How long have you been coughing?" Rostam asked. "Since San Gabriel. Maybe before." Matteo rested his staff across his knees. His hands, once the strongest things about him, trembled slightly when they were not holding something. "The lime. 20 years of lime dust. It sits in the chest and waits." "You should see a doctor." "I have seen doctors. Doctors say rest. Rest says stop working. Stop working says stop living. The math does not favor the doctor." Rostam said nothing. He knew the math. He had watched his father work through a cough that had grown worse over 2 years in Yazd, until the cough was louder than the words and the words stopped coming. "I want to tell you something," Matteo said. "And I want you to listen because I will not say it twice." "Oh," Rostam listened. "You build well. Better than most men I have trained, and I have trained many. But building well is only half of what keeps a craft alive. The other half is giving it away. Every wall I have built is gone or going. Adobe does not last forever, neither do I." He tapped the ground with his staff. "But the men I taught are still building. Their walls will outlast mine, and the men they teach will outlast them. That is how a craft survives, not in the wall, in the hand." Rostam looked at his own hands, scarred, cracked, stained with clay and lime. His father's hands had looked the same. "I was afraid," Rostam said quietly, "that Americans would take the idea and still despise me." "Some will," Matteo said. "Teach anyway. A wall does not ask who leans on it." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that exists between men who have worked together long enough that the work itself has become a language, and the language does not require sound. Matteo's cough worsened through August. He came to the dome site less frequently. His morning arrivals, which had once been punctual as sunrise, became irregular, some days early, some days not at all. On the days he came, he worked for shorter periods before sitting down. His clouded eye which had always been a minor impairment, seemed to trouble him more. He held his head at a different angle, as if compensating for a change in what the good eye could see. On a morning in late August, after a lesson on repairing cracks before they widened, a lesson Matteo delivered while sitting on a stone because standing for more than a few minutes winded him, he reached into his leather pouch and removed his wooden float. The float was old, smooth from decades of use, the handle worn to the exact shape of Matteo's grip. It was the most personal tool a plasterer owned, more intimate than a trowel, more revealing than a level. "Your hand knows enough now," Matteo said. He held the float out. Rostam took it. The wood was warm from the pouch. The handle did not fit his hand. It was shaped for a different grip, a different palm. But the weight was right, and the balance was familiar, and the gesture behind it was the oldest gesture in any craft. Master to student, hand to hand, the tool that says, "I have taught you what I can." "Where will you go?" Rostam asked. "Relatives, near the coast. My wife's sister's family, if they will have me. The air's better there." Matteo stood slowly, bracing on his staff. "Better for breathing, at least. Not better for building." "Will you come back?" Matteo looked at the dome. White, squat, solid against the brown desert. The building his teaching had helped complete. "The dome will be here whether I come back or not. That is the point of building with earth. It does not need the builder." He walked away with his mesquite staff tapping the hard pan, his limp more pronounced than when he had arrived 6 weeks earlier. He did not look back. Craftsmen who understand the work do not look back at the work. They look ahead, toward the next wall, the next lesson, the next pair of hands that needs shaping. There was a weight in the dome that evening that had nothing to do with heat or clay. Rostam sat in the sleeping pit with Matteo's float across his knees, and the darkness pressed in like the memory of every teacher who had left before the student was ready. His father in Yazd, coughing through lessons. Matteo in the Mojave, coughing through corrections. The earth is slow. That is why men live. But the men themselves are fast, faster than the walls they build, faster than the lessons they leave behind. Matteo's float was smooth and warm and shaped for a hand that was already gone, carrying its cough westward toward air that might save it or might simply provide a softer place to stop. Rostam pressed his palm against the inside wall of the dome. Cool, always cool. His father's wall in Yazd and Matteo's corrections in the Mojave and his own bleeding hands in the Burlap. All of it lived in 3 feet of clay that would not let the sun through. He held his palm there until the coolness entered his skin, and then he picked up the float and went to check the whitewash on the south face, because there was work to do, and the work would not wait for grief. The secondary crisis arrived before Rostam had time to mourn. A late summer thunderstorm, the kind the Mojave produces with sudden violence. Black clouds stacking over the mountains and dumping rain in sheets that turn dry washes into rivers within minutes. The storm hit Camp Cady at 4 in the afternoon on a September day that had started clear and hot and gave no warning except a shift in the wind at 2 o'clock and a line of cloud shadow that moved across the flats faster than a man could run. Rain hit first, not gentle rain. Desert rain, fat, hard drops that struck the ground like thrown stones, kicking up dust plumes that turned to mud spatters within seconds. Then the wind, then the sound, a low roar from the east, from the wash, where a wall of brown water was moving down the channel with the speed and indifference of something that had no concern for what lay in its path. Flash flood. Hiram's thin cooling shed, the mud-over-wood imitation he had built after the heat wave, charging men a quarter to sleep inside during hot nights, dissolved at the base within minutes. The wood frame held but the mud walls, 6 inches thick and unbonded, slumped away like wet sugar. The structure that had been Hiram's answer to Rostam's dome collapsed into a heap of sticks and brown slurry while Hiram watched from his porch. 2 water barrels broke loose from Loomis's freight yard and tumbled down the slope toward Cora's wash shelter. The shelter, the half-dome she and Rostam had built together, 3 weeks old, squat and solid with 18-inch walls, took the impact of the first barrel on its curved south face. The barrel struck, bounced, and rolled past. The wall held. The second barrel hit the entrance and shattered against the thick clay lip of the doorway, spilling water and stave wood across the packed earth floor. Cora, inside the shelter at the moment of impact, screamed once, a sound of surprise, not injury, and then went silent. She pressed against the back wall and watched the water rush past the entrance. The shelter held because it was round, because the curve distributed force, because the walls were thick enough to absorb impact, and because Rostam had built the entrance lip 6 inches above ground level, which diverted the surface flow around the structure instead of through it. But the main dome was in greater danger. It sat 30 yards from the wash, on slightly higher ground, but the flood was spreading beyond the channel. Brown water crept across the flat, ankle deep and rising, carrying debris, sticks, stones, a dead snake, a cavalry saddle blanket that had blown off a rail. Rostam ran. He reached the dome and assessed in seconds. Water was lapping at the base of the south wall, finding the threshold of the north-facing entrance. If water entered the dome and soaked the interior floor, the sleeping pit would flood, and the clay at the base of the walls, the thickest section, the most critical for structural support, would begin to soften from the inside. He needed to divert the water. He needed Mateo. Mateo was gone. He needed Mateo's lessons. Those were still here. Mateo had told him on the third day of their work together about drainage. Adobe fears water the way wood fears fire, but fire must touch wood to burn it. Water only needs to sit. A wall that stands in a puddle for a day is weaker than a wall that takes rain for an hour. The rain runs off, the puddle soaks in. Rostam grabbed the shovel Pollard had lent him for the sleeping pit excavation. He cut a channel, fast, shallow, angled away from the dome's north side toward lower ground to the east. He dug with the desperation of a man who understood that 6 weeks of labor could dissolve in 6 minutes. Pollard's men arrived. 2 cavalrymen who had been securing the horse corral saw Rostam digging and understood immediately. They grabbed tools, an army spade, a pick, and extended the channel. The 3 men worked in the rain, in the mud, in water that was now ankle-deep around the dome's base. Cora appeared from her shelter, soaked and shaking. She saw the water at the dome's base and understood the danger. She grabbed a piece of the shattered barrel stave and began scraping a secondary channel on the south side, directing surface flow away from the wall. Rostam cut the north drain open, a gap in the low earthen berm he had built around the dome's perimeter as a windbreak. Water rushed through the gap and spread east across the flat, losing depth as it spread. The flood level at the dome's base dropped from ankle deep to a thin sheet. He reinforced the threshold with packed stone. Cobbles gathered from the wash bank weeks earlier for a future project, now pressed into service as a temporary dam across the entrance. The stones diverted the remaining surface flow around the threshold and away from the interior. Then he ordered everyone back. "The clay is trembling," he said. He pressed his palm against the base wall. Through the wet surface, he could feel a vibration. Not structural failure, not cracking, but the deep shiver of saturated earth adjusting to new weight. The wall was absorbing water from below, and the absorbed water was changing the clay's behavior. If the absorption went too deep, the base would soften and the dome above it would settle unevenly. Cracks would appear, the cracks would widen, the dome would fail. Everyone out until the clay stops moving. They stood in the rain, 30 feet from the dome, and watched. Cora's arms were wrapped around herself. Pollard's men stood with their tools hanging. Rostam pressed his palms together, feeling Mateo's float in his waistband like a talisman. The rain lasted another 20 minutes. Then it stopped, as desert storms stop. Suddenly, completely, the sky clearing from west to east, as if someone had pulled a curtain. The air smelled of wet clay and creosote, and something electric that had no name. The floodwater receded within an hour. The wash, which had been a roaring channel, returned to its usual trickle. The flat around the dome drained into the channels Rostam and the soldiers had cut, and the standing water at the base dropped to a damp stain. Rostam entered the dome alone. He walked the interior in the dark, pressing his palm against the base wall at 12 points around the circumference. Damp on the exterior face, dry on the interior face. The vibration had stopped. The clay had absorbed water to a depth of perhaps 2 inches on the outside, but 3 feet of wall thickness meant the water had 22 inches of dry clay between it and the interior. The dome had survived not because it was waterproof. It was not. It had survived because it was placed above the wash line, because the base wall was thick enough to absorb surface moisture without compromising structural integrity, because the channels diverted sustained flooding, and because Rostam had learned from Mateo that water must never be allowed to sit against an earth wall. Discipline, not magic, not luck. The same discipline his father had practiced in Yazd, where rain was rare but devastating, and the same discipline Mateo had reinforced in 6 weeks of morning lessons. A wall built with discipline survived what a wall built with hope did not. Hiram's cooling shed, built with 6-inch walls and no drainage, was a pile of sticks in a mud puddle. The structure had lasted 19 days. Rostam's dome, built with 3-foot walls and proper drainage, did not crack. The flood changed the camp's calculations in a way the heat wave alone had not. Heat was familiar. Every summer brought heat, and men had strategies, bad strategies, but strategies for enduring it. But a flood that dissolved a building in minutes was a different lesson. It demonstrated that Hiram's imitation was not merely less effective than Rostam's original. It was dangerous. A man sleeping inside a 6-inch mud wall when a storm hit could be buried. 3 families approached Rostam within a week of the flood. 2 freighter families and a cavalry sergeant's wife, each with the same request: mark a dome circle for us. Rostam agreed, but with conditions. Each family built a 1-foot model first. Each model was inspected. Each builder learned the clay mix, the crack prevention, the whitewash schedule, the drainage plan. He refused to mark a full-size circle until the model satisfied him. "The desert charges interest," Rostam told a freighter named Hadley, who was impatient with the model stage. "A shortcut is only debt you pay later." Hadley built his model. It cracked on the 2nd day. He built it again. It held. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, why the work you do before the crisis determines whether you survive it, share it with someone who understands that survival is built before the storm arrives. Cora's role shifted after the flood. She had been an observer, then a reluctant ally, then a builder. Now she became something the project needed almost as much as clay and sacks: an organizer. Her English was clearer than Rostam's. Her handwriting was legible. Her ability to translate Rostam's technical concepts into plain speech that a freighter or cavalry wife could follow was a skill neither Rostam nor Mateo possessed. She began keeping a ledger: measurements, clay ratios, curing times, whitewash schedules. in a ruled notebook she had bought from Hiram's supply shelf with her own money. Hiram had sold her the notebook without comment. He had no reason to refuse a sale, and refusing would have been an admission that he knew what the notebook was for. But he watched Cora carry it to the dome site, and the watching cost him something. The partnership between Rostam and Cora was not romantic, not yet. It was the partnership of two competent people who had discovered that their competencies fit together like a joint in well-laid masonry. He knew the walls. She knew the words. He could build a dome that survived 123 degrees and a flash flood. She could explain it to a woman who had never held a trowel in terms that woman could follow. They argued. About sequence desa sedan, Cora wanted to teach whitewash first because it was visible and satisfying, while Rostam insisted on foundation work first because a pretty wall on a bad base was a death trap. About pace, Cora wanted 3 families building simultaneously, while Rostam refused to supervise more than one at a time because mistakes in earth construction were invisible until they became catastrophic. About credit, Cora wanted to list the dome's performance data on a sheet that could be given to passing freighters, while Rostam resisted anything that felt like advertisement because his father had taught him that craft speaks for itself. Your father built in a city where everyone knew his name, Cora said, scrubbing a shirt with more force than the stains required. You are building in a desert where no one can pronounce your name. The craft cannot speak for itself if no one knows it exists. Rostam had no answer for that. She was right, and being right was her most consistent quality. Their courtship happened through work, through mornings spent marking foundation circles, and evenings spent reviewing Cora's ledger by lamplight. Through corrections, Cora pointing out that Rostam's diagrams used measurements no American builder would recognize, Rostam pointing out that Cora's descriptions of the clay mix omitted the silt ratio. Through shared water during the long afternoons when the heat made conversation impossible, and silence was its own form of company. Through a moment, unremarkable to anyone watching, when Rostam handed Cora a filled sack tube and she set it into the course of her wash shelter wall with a placement so clean that Rostam said, "Good," and Cora said, "I know," and neither of them looked at the other, and both of them smiled. Hiram Voss, meanwhile, was cornered. His cooling shed had dissolved. His imitation of Rostam's dome had failed publicly, spectacularly, and in a rainstorm witnessed by the entire camp. His authority, built on the premise that survival required the supplies only he could sell, was eroding with every dome circle Rostam marked in the dirt. Men who had once bought canvas on credit now built with earth and labor. Women who had suffered through summers under canvas that trapped heat now asked Cora about wall thickness and vent schedules. Hiram's response was accusation. He stood on his porch one September afternoon and spoke loudly enough for 3 teamsters and a cavalry corporal to hear. That Persian is ruining my business. He gives away what honest men sell. He builds mud houses that will kill someone when they fall, and when they fall, he will be gone. He is a foreigner who does not belong here, building foreign nonsense on American soil, and the first man who dies in one of those dirt piles, I will hold him responsible. The speech was aimed at the camp. It was heard by the camp, and the camp, which had watched Eli Dobb walk out of the dome alive, watched the cooling shed dissolve in the rain, and watched 3 families begin building dome foundations, gave Hiram's speech the response it deserved. Silence. Not hostile silence. Not the silence of men who disagreed but were afraid to speak. The silence of men who had already decided and did not find the argument interesting enough to engage. Hiram's words fell on ground that had already absorbed a different lesson, and the ground did not shift. Rostam heard the speech. He was working on Hadley's foundation circle, 40 yards from Hiram's porch. He straightened up, clay on his hands, and looked at Hiram. The camp watched. The moment hung. Rostam spoke. It was the first time he had responded publicly to Hiram since the expulsion in May. "No," Rostam said. His voice carried across the flat, even ground, not raised, not angry, but clear. "The sun did that. I only showed men where to stand." He went back to work. The camp went back to its business. Hiram stood on his porch with his ledger and his authority and his silence, and the silence was no longer a weapon. It was the sound of a man who had run out of things to say. Hiram Voss was not a man who surrendered. He was a man who adapted, and adaptation in Hiram's case meant finding a new angle on the same ambition. If he could not sell canvas and credit to men who were building with earth, he would sell the earth itself, or rather, sell access to it, shaped by his hand, on his terms. In early October, Hiram began building a larger dome behind his supply shed. He did not ask Rostam for instruction. He did not consult Cora's ledger. He watched from his porch as Rostam worked on the Hadley family foundation, and he copied what he could see from 50 yards away. The circular base, the coiled tubes, the general shape. What he could not see from 50 yards was everything that mattered. He used the wrong clay mix. Too much sand, not enough silt, because he dug from the nearest bank rather than testing batches. He built walls 12 inches thick instead of 36, because thicker walls meant more labor and more time, and Hiram measured everything in the currency of effort saved. He painted only the south-facing section white, because whitewash costs labor, and he assumed the visible portion was sufficient. He skipped the night vent entirely because a hole in the roof seemed like a flaw, not a feature, and he built the entrance wide and straight because a low bent entrance looked like a crawl space, and Hiram wanted his dome to look like a building, not a burrow. He charged men a quarter per night to sleep inside during hot evenings. 3 men paid on the first night. They entered the dome at sundown and lay on the packed earth floor, expecting the coolness that Rostam's dome delivered. They did not find it. 12-inch walls did not have the mass to delay heat past midday, let alone through an entire afternoon. By the time the men entered at sundown, the walls had been fully saturated with the day's heat and were radiating it inward. The single-coat whitewash on the south face had cracked and peeled because Hiram applied it at noon, exactly the error Mateo had warned against, and the exposed clay absorbed direct sun on the unpainted sections. The wide, straight entrance let light pour in, and the light carried radiant heat that warmed every surface it touched. And without a vent, the hot air that rose to the dome's crown had nowhere to go. It pooled, pressed down, and turned the interior into exactly what Pollard had once predicted: a stove. The 3 men lasted 2 hours. One of them, a freighter's assistant named Polk, woke in the dark, gasping, his skin hot and clammy, his head pounding. The air inside the dome was thick, close, and warm. Not the killing heat of an open desert afternoon, but the suffocating warmth of a sealed space where heat enters and cannot leave. Polk crawled to the entrance and pulled himself outside. The other 2 followed. Pollard heard about it the next morning. He walked to Hiram's dome, entered, and stood inside for 60 seconds. He emerged with his jaw set. "Open this," Pollard said. "Now, and refund those men." "It needs adjustment," Hiram said. "The vent?" "You do not have a vent. You have a sealed box with 12-inch walls and no air circulation. A man could suffocate in there on a bad night." Pollard stepped closer. He was not a large man, but his authority was the kind that came from 15 years of making decisions that kept men alive, and his voice carried the weight of every one of those decisions. "Open it, refund the money, and do not charge another man to sleep inside until you understand what you are building." Hiram opened the dome. He refunded the quarter to each man, counting the coins out on his porch with the deliberation of a man paying a debt he believed he did not owe. The camp watched. The camp always watched. 3 days later, Hiram did the thing that cost him more than any refund. He walked to Rostam's dome. He did not walk fast. He did not walk with purpose. He walked the way a man walks when each step takes him closer to something he does not want to face. The camp watched him cross the 40 yards between his porch and Rostam's build site, and the watching had a quality that was different from the usual camp attention. This was not gossip. This was a reckoning. Rostam was applying whitewash to Cora's wash shelter. He saw Hiram approaching and set the float down. He did not stand. He crouched beside the wall with the whitewash bucket at his knee and waited. Hiram stopped 10 feet away. He did not remove his hat. He did not offer pleasantries. He stood with his hands at his sides and his ledger absent, the first time Rostam had seen Hiram without the ledger since May. "What did I do wrong?" Hiram asked. The words came out flat, stripped of the performance that usually colored Hiram's speech. This was not a public declaration. This was a man asking a question because he did not know the answer, and the not knowing had become more expensive than the asking. Rostam looked at Hiram. He looked at the man who had thrown his bedroll in the dust, stolen his water ticket, doubled his water price, sent men to steal his sacks, called his dome an oven in front of the camp, and refused to let a dying boy enter it. He looked at the man who had tried to copy the shape without understanding the reason, and nearly suffocated 3 men in the process. "You copied the shell," Rostam said. "You did not copy the patience." Hiram waited for more. Rostam gave it, not because Hiram deserved generosity, but because Mateo had taught him that a wall does not ask who leans on it, and because his father had taught him that a man who hoards knowledge hoards something that dies in the keeping. 12 inches is not enough. You need 30 at the base, 24 at minimum for the mid-wall. Your clay was wrong, too much sand, no silt testing, no worm test. You whitewashed in noon heat so the coating cracked and peeled instead of bonding. You left 3/4 of the surface uncoated, so the sun entered the wall on every unpainted face. Your entrance is straight and wide, which lets light in, and light is heat. And you have no vent. Without a vent, the dome stores heat every day and never releases it. After 2 days, the inside is worse than the outside. Hiram listened without interrupting. His face was difficult to read, resentment and calculation in equal measure. The expression of a man who is learning something he needs from someone he would rather not need it from. "The vent alone would not save your dome," Rostam continued. "Your walls are too thin. The heat passes through 12 inches in 4 hours. By afternoon, the inside wall is as hot as the outside. You would need to vent all day, which defeats the purpose. The thickness is the foundation. Everything else, the whitewash, the darkness, the vent, the sealed entrance, works only because the thickness gives it time." "How thick?" 30 inches minimum for this climate. 36 is better. Every additional inch costs a day of labor and buys you an hour of cool. Hiram looked at his own dome, visible beyond his supply shed. 12 inches, 1/3 of the minimum, 1/4 of the ideal. "I cannot rebuild that," he said. "No," Rostam agreed. "You can build a new one. Or you can tear that one down before someone else tries to sleep in it." Hiram stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his porch without another word. He did not build a new dome. He did not tear the old one down either, not immediately. But he stopped charging men to sleep in it, and he posted no sign, and within a week the structure stood empty, its wide entrance gaping at the desert like a mouth with nothing to say. Hiram's conversion, such as it was, arrived not as a change of heart, but as a change of economics. He could not sell canvas to men who built with earth. He could not sell credit to men who owed him nothing. But he could sell the one thing those men still needed: sacks, ruined grain sacks, mouse-chewed coffee sacks, torn flour sacks, the raw material of Rostam's method. Hiram had been throwing them away for years. Now he piled them on a shelf and priced them at 3 cents each. It was not generosity. It was the business instinct of a man who understood that when the current changes, a smart trader changes his inventory. Hiram would never be kind to Rostam. He would never acknowledge what the dome had done for the camp, or for Eli, or for the 3 men his own imitation had nearly killed. But he would sell sacks, and selling sacks meant accepting that the dome method was here to stay, and accepting that was its own form of surrender. Rostam bought the first batch. He spread them on the ground beside the dome and sorted them by condition, the same ritual he had performed at the refuse heap in May, when the sacks were trash and the dome was theory. He sorted, and Cora noted the count in her ledger, and neither of them remarked on the fact that Hiram was now selling what he had once thrown away at a price that was, by any reasonable standard, extortion for garbage. 3 cents a sack, Cora said, writing the number. For material he swept off his floor. 3 cents is cheaper than dying, Rostam said. Everything is cheaper than dying. That does not make 3 cents fair. No, but it makes 3 cents possible. By the following summer, the summer of 1871, 6 small earthen cooling structures stood near the Mojave Road within a mile of Camp Cady. One for water storage built by Loomis, its barrel vault top fitted with a canvas loading flap. One for fever rest, built by a cavalry sergeant's wife named Mrs. Behringer, who had watched her youngest suffer through the previous summer's heat and decided she would not watch again. One for freight perishables built by a teamster cooperative that pooled sacks and labor, and 3 family shelters built by the families of Hadley, Polk, and a mule skinner named Dunfield. Each structure bore the marks of its builder's skill and Rostam's supervision. Hadley's dome leaned slightly east, a construction error in the 3rd course that Rostam had decided to let stand because correcting it would have required dismantling a week's work, and the lean was within tolerance. Polk's dome was smaller than planned because Polk ran out of sacks at the 9th course and refused to buy more from Hiram on principle. Mrs. Behringer's shelter was the most precisely built of the 6 because Mrs. Behringer was a woman who measured twice, cut once, and did not tolerate imprecision in herself or others. Rostam's original dome remained the coldest. Its walls were the thickest, the full 36 inches he had specified from the beginning. Its sleeping pit was the deepest, 3 feet below ground level, where the earth held the memory of winter long into summer. Its whitewash was the most carefully maintained. Cora had instituted a renewal schedule of thin coats every 10 days, applied at dawn, 3 coats per renewal. The dome's south face was so white it hurt to look at in direct sun, and the brightness was not cosmetic. Every photon reflected was a photon that did not enter the wall. Pollard's powder store, built to military specification with Rostam's conditions honored in full, kept its contents cool and stable through 2 summers. The black powder inside showed no degradation. The ammunition remained reliable. Pollard sent notes to Fort Mojave describing the structure and language that stripped away any trace of wonder or personality. Thick, white adobe shelter of unusual performance, constructed by civilian method, suitable for temperature-sensitive stores. The note did not mention Rostam by name, but it described the method in enough detail that a competent builder at another post could reproduce it, and that was the form immortality took in military correspondence. The camp changed in ways that were visible only if you had known it before the dome. Men who had once gathered under canvas at midday now dispersed to cooler structures. Women who had suffered through afternoons with softening soap and stiffening laundry now worked in shaded rooms where the temperature held at 80 instead of 115. Children napped in the afternoons in cool pits dug into dome floors, and their mothers checked on them by touch, a hand on the forehead, a palm on the chest, and found them cool and sleeping instead of flushed and restless. The camp had not become comfortable. The Mojave did not permit comfort, but it had become survivable in a way that did not require Hiram's ledger or Hiram's prices or Hiram's permission. And that shift, from survival through purchase dependence to survival through shared knowledge, was Rostam's real legacy, though he would not have used that word. He would have said he taught men to build walls. The walls did the rest. Cora and Rostam married in November of 1871. The ceremony, if it could be called that, was conducted by Pollard, who had the authority to officiate civil marriages at a military post and the temperament to keep the proceedings brief. They stood outside the dome on a morning when the air was cool enough to be pleasant, one of the brief windows between summer's punishment and winter's chill. And Pollard read from a manual, and Cora wore a clean shirt, and Rostam wore his least stained trousers, and Mrs. Barringer served coffee afterward from a pot she had brewed inside her dome, where the temperature held steady enough to keep coffee warm without boiling it away. It was not a sentimental occasion. Rostam and Cora were not sentimental people. They were practical people who had discovered through months of shared work and argument and correction and silence that they were better together than apart. She handled records, trade, and arguments with customers who wanted shortcuts. He handled wall lines, soil, and teaching. She wrote the English he could not. He built the walls she could not. The partnership was not equal. No partnership is. But it was balanced in the way that a well-built wall is balanced, each element carrying what the other could not, the whole stronger than either part. Their courtship had happened through work, and their marriage continued through work. The dome became their home. Cora's ledger grew thicker. Rostam's notebook, the one he had carried from Yazd with his father's sketches, sat on a shelf he had built into the dome's interior wall, a niche cut into the thick clay where the temperature was constant and the pages stayed dry. Over the following years, the Mojave Road changed. The railroad expanded. Settlements shifted. Camp Cady's garrison shrank further and was abandoned entirely by 1871. The same year, Rostam and Cora married. The camp infrastructure decayed, but the domes did not decay at the same rate. They were slower. They were always slower. Freighters still used the road. Prospectors still passed through, heading toward strikes that were mostly rumor and returning with nothing but sunburn and debt. Families still needed shelter at the relay points. And at the point where Camp Cady had been, a cluster of white mounds sat against the brown desert, like something the earth had grown on its own. Rostam repaired them. He renewed the whitewash. He taught anyone who stopped long enough to learn. Some learned well. Some learned badly. Some took the shape and ignored the reason, and their domes cracked within a year, and Rostam did not say, "I told you so," because the cracked dome said it for him. A son arrived in 1873. A daughter in 1875. They grew up in the dome, and the dome was their first understanding of the world, that the outside was bright and hot and fast, and the inside was dark and cool and slow, and the wall between them was the work of human hands. Rostam taught his son to test clay with the worm method. The boy at 5 could roll a worm and call the crack point within half an inch. His daughter at 3 fell asleep in the pit every afternoon with her cheek on the cool earth and her hands curled around a wooden float. Not Mateo's float, which Rostam kept on the shelf beside his father's notebook, but a small one carved for a child's grip. The years compressed the way years do, not evenly, not kindly, but with a steady accumulation of detail that turns experience into a life. Rostam's hands grew stiffer, his hair grayed. The scar on his forearm from the night he slipped on the dome clearing the vent plug whitened and puckered. The scar on his palm from the second night never fully flattened. He carried the dome's construction in his body the way soldiers carry their wars, not as memory, but as geography, mapped in tissue. Cora's ledger filled 3 notebooks, then 4, then 5. The first page of the first notebook still listed the original cost: $2 for ruined sacks, nothing for the earth, and everything else paid in labor. She kept that page clean and legible, recopying it whenever the ink faded, because it answered a question that men kept asking. What does it cost? With an answer that made the asking seem foolish. Mateo Chacon died on the coast in 1874. The news arrived through a chain of freighters and letters that took 3 months to reach the Mojave. A nephew wrote in Spanish that Mateo had passed quietly, that his cough had not improved, that he was buried beside his wife in a churchyard near San Gabriel. The letter said nothing about adobe or domes or craft. It said an old man had gone home and stayed. Rostam read the letter in the dome, sitting in the pit with Mateo's float across his knees. The wood was smoother now than when Mateo had given it. Rostam's hands had polished it further, layering their own years onto the years Mateo had already given. He held the float and felt the shape of another man's grip beneath his own, and the dome was silent around him the way the dome was always silent, patient, thick, slow. He did not cry. He pressed his palm against the inside wall and held it there until the coolness entered his skin, which was the closest thing to prayer he had. Hiram Voss left Camp Cady in 1872, when the garrison's closure eliminated the reliable customer base his supply operation depended on. He sold his shed to a freighter for salvaged lumber, packed his ledger and his remaining stock into a wagon, and drove west toward opportunities that did not involve competing with a man who gave away his knowledge for free. He never returned. He never wrote. He was absorbed into the stream of frontier merchants who moved from post to post, selling what men needed at prices men could barely afford, and his name survived only in Cora's ledger, on the first page, in the column marked Water Ticket Withheld. Eli Dobbs stayed. He worked for Loomis, then for himself, hauling freight on the Mojave Road until the road's traffic thinned to nothing. He built a dome, a small one, barely large enough for a cot and a trunk, using techniques he had watched Rostam teach others during the months after his recovery. The dome was not pretty. The whitewash was uneven. The entrance was slightly too wide, but the walls were 30 inches thick, and the sleeping pit held 68 degrees on the worst days, and Eli never told anyone about the 4 nights he had spent on Rostam's floor at 65 degrees while the desert outside tried to kill him. He did not need to tell. The dome told for him. Years later, when the road carried fewer wagons and more silence, a young cavalryman or freighter, the accounts do not agree on which, stopped at the cluster of white mounds and studied them with the curiosity of a man seeing something he did not understand. He had been riding for 2 days. His canteen was low. The heat was the steady, punishing heat of a Mojave afternoon, the kind that makes the air shimmer and the ground radiate, and a man's thoughts slow to the pace of his horse's walk. He looked at the largest mound, low, white, windowless, with a dark entrance so small a man would have to kneel to enter. "Looks like a clay oven," he said to no one in particular. Cora, who was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 dome walls, heard him. She was older now, sun-darkened, strong-handed, her hair pulled back with a strip of the same jute she used for sack tubes. She laughed once. A short laugh, dry as the air, carrying the weight of every man who had ever said the same thing and been wrong in exactly the same way. "Go inside," she said. The young man hesitated. He looked at the dark entrance. He looked at the white walls gleaming in the sun. He looked at Cora, who had already gone back to her laundry and was not interested in his decision. He knelt and entered. Rostam was inside. He was older now, gray-bearded, his hands stiff and scarred, his body carrying the desert's years in the way desert men carry them, which is to say quietly and without complaint. He sat in the pit on a worn blanket with a notebook open on his knee, the same notebook, though the binding had been replaced twice, and the pages bore the marks of 3 decades of clay dust and lime residue. Mateo's float lay on the shelf beside it, polished to the color of dark honey. The young man stood in the dome and felt the air. Cool, not cold. Not the cool of a cellar or a mine. The cool of earth that has been patient longer than the sun has been angry. The cool of walls that absorb the day's heat inch by inch and release it into the night, starting fresh each morning, forgetting the sun the way only slow things can forget. "How is this possible?" the young man asked. Rostam looked up from his notebook. His eyes, dark and sharp beneath the gray brows, held the expression of a man who had answered this question many times and had never grown tired of it, because the answer was his father's answer, and his mentor's answer, and his own answer, and the answer did not wear out with repetition. "The sun is fast," Rostam said. "The earth is slow." The young man waited for more. Rostam closed the notebook and pressed his palm against the inside wall, the scarred hand, the one that had bled on the dome's white crown the night he cleared the vent while a boy lay dying on his floor. "Make the sun spend itself before it reaches you," he said. "That is all." Outside, the Mojave moved fast. The wind scoured the flats. The heat pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck. The light was merciless, brilliant, the light of a place that forgave nothing and forgot nothing and waited for every weakness with the patience of something that had outlasted everything else. Inside, the earth remained slow. 65 degrees in the pit at dawn, the white shell burning under the sun, the dark interior holding the night, and the scarred hand of a plasterer's son pressed against the cool wall, feeling what his father had felt in Yazd, what Mateo had felt at San Gabriel, what the clay itself had always known. Within 2 summers of Rostam's first dome, 12 men and women had learned the method along the Mojave Road. Not 1,200, not 12,000. 12. But 12 who understood the reason, not just the shape, and who carried the wall thickness and the whitewash schedule and the night vent ritual in their hands the way Rostam carried them, as something given, not sold, and worth more for the giving. Rostam Bahmani lived out his later years near the same road that had nearly killed him. He never became rich. He became something rarer in a place where wealth was measured in credit and leverage, a man whose knowledge could not be repossessed. Cora kept the ledger. The first page still listed the original cost, $2 for ruined sacks, nothing for the earth. And everything else paid in labor, in patience, in the slow work of hands that believed the wall before the wall believed itself. Hiram Voss had stood on his porch in the heat of a May afternoon and called the dome an oven. "This one is making his own oven," he had said, and the laughter had carried across the camp like something sure of itself. On the hottest day anyone at Camp Cady had ever recorded, 123 degrees in shade, metal-burning hands, horses refusing feed, a boy collapsed on the hard pan with his body forgetting how to cool itself. Men had carried that boy into the oven and found the floor cool beneath their knees. The thermometer had settled at 65 in the dark pit, while the white shell outside burned under the Mojave sun. Rostam's scarred hand pressed the inside wall the way his father's hand had pressed the wall in Yazd. Outside, the desert moved fast. Inside, the earth was slow, and the slow thing outlasted everything.